I'm going to introduce very briefly the next couple of speakers, and I'm going to introduce them in the interest of time together. First speaker will be another Ethiopian, Soleyana Shimeles Gebremichael, a lawyer and one of the founders of the Zone 9 bloggers, an Ethiopian group comprising, in addition to Soleyana, an engineer, a university lecturer, a data manager in the health ministry, some journalists and others, who were charged with terrorism in April 2014 simply for urging that Ethiopia respect the human rights provisions in its own constitution. Most of the Zone 9 bloggers, along with many other government critics, are now in jail. Soleyana happened to be out of the country when the others were arrested, so she was charged in absentia, but she continues to advocate for human rights in Ethiopia through her role as coordinator of the Ethiopian Human Rights Project. Soleyana will be followed by Professor Stefan Dercon of Oxford University, who is an exceptional development economist who has conducted some of the most meticulous research in developing countries on poverty and well-being at the household level, and he's worked particularly in Ethiopia. He's also advised numerous foreign aid organizations, including the World Bank, on poverty reduction strategies. So, Soleyana first, please welcome her.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today, and thanks for coming, and thanks for the conference coordinators to invite me here to share my stories and share the story of my friends in prison and many more people in Ethiopia. Last year in April, 9 Ethiopian young bloggers and journalists, all close friends of mine, get arrested in one Friday from their workplaces. They were working for a government agency, they were working for private institutes. Most of them were professional young people who had been working for the Ethiopian Airlines, for the government health ministry, and for the bank and also for the university. All of them were young professionals in their 20s and early 30s. When this wave of arrest happened to my friends, I was chatting with one of them online about the article that we were planning to write to our blog. So he immediately mentioned that he was called by the police, and he also mentioned his last word, they might arrest me, and then he get offline. From 9 of the arrested people, 6 of them are my colleagues in our small bloggers collective, which we call Zone 9. The remaining 3 journalists were also close friends of our group. So Zone 9 is a group of bloggers collective which was established in May 2012. Some of you might have already asked, rightly so, why Zone 9? What is Zone 9? Or like instead of Zone 1 or 10 or 5. The reason why we called our group Zone 9 and what has happened to us now tells us a lot about Ethiopia. I may say this name is the firstborn of the marriage between the online and offline engagement in Ethiopia. Zone 9 bloggers, 9 of us, introduced to each other first virtually due to our online activities, especially on social media. Our public exchanges on Facebook and inbox and somehow on Twitter later developed an accidental offline collaboration to raise money for an Ethiopian maid who lost her life in Beirut. So it was not basically, the first gathering was not basically about blogging together. That was early in 2012. Before and during this time, we used to visit some political prisoners separately. Gradually visiting the prisoners in pairs and groups comes to be one of our weekends routines and rituals. In one of visiting days, when we were visiting journalist Riot Alamu, who is known for her critics of the government by being columnist for different newspapers, and she's also a winner of Courage of Journalists Award. And we were discussing with her on prison conditions, and she told us that the notorious Kaliti prison, where she is detained, has 8 zones. So it has 8 zones with different people, and the 8th one is the zone for women. And she said that the prisoners refers the country outside of the prison compound as Zone 9, implying we are all prisoners of some kind. No other name fit better than Zone 9 for a group of youngsters who were obsessed with more freedom and justice. We adopted the name in recognition to our lack of freedom and in honor for those political prisoners in symbolic 8 zones all over the country. After a couple of discussions, we agreed to bring all our online efforts and readers together, as it would help to inspire alternative narrative and better public discourse. Our objective was clear. We were working together to create an independent alternative platform where different narratives on social and political conditions of our beloved country can be discussed and thereby foster public discourse. We had dreams that such engagement may contribute to the betterment of the country, and our motto was very simple and clear. We said we blog because we care. We are from different disciplines and walks of life, even though we are of the same generation. We started blogging in May 2012 and progressively managed to attract small but engaging and active young people in the first few months. In the first week of our blog, we have opened 6 different blogs because every blog was blocked by the government within 24 hours of publishing its first article. Then we finally get tired opening another blog, so we keep the last one as our blog and shifted our conversation to social media so that people would access it from home. From the start, we knew that blogging, particularly which is critical of the government, is not going to be easy. Not only because of the blocking of our website, but we also knew very well that most critical journalists ended up in jail or in exile after a few years of attempt. Of course, I admit that we somehow undermined the threat, assuming that online media would not be victim of such harsh crackdown, as an impact would be very limited due to a very slow internet connectivity by the time. And the internet infrastructure is also so poor. By the time we started blogging, the internet penetration was less than 1.5%. Within 2 years now, it is 2% of the population who can access the internet. But to the opposite of our assumption, the arrest in April last year was followed by almost 3 months of brutal interrogation on 6 bloggers and 3 journalists who had been a friend of us. The first reason for the arrest given by the government was, it is a quote from the charge, "We were found preparing to incite violence following the coming of the 2015 Ethiopian election by using social media." And imagine it is 2% that the internet penetration is in the country. The accusation was changed to the act of planning, preparing, conspiracy, and incitement of terrorism. On the 23rd day of the arrest, the police came to the court and said they changed the accusation to terrorism. And finally, the government took the alleged crimes one step further and formally charged 7 bloggers, including myself, and 3 independent journalists for terrorism. As it was mentioned on the introduction, I'm a lawyer by training and civil society advocate, and ended up to be a terrorist charged for blogging part-time. The 9 prisoners were not allowed family visits, let alone by their lawyers, on the earlier days of their interrogation in Maakalawi. During the interrogation, male bloggers and journalists were forced to torture, heavy physical exercise, and long hours and nighttime interrogations, and also sleep deprivation. Not only that, female detainees were facing abuses, interrogations including sleep deprivation, physical exercise, and in some cases, they were also forced to be naked during interrogation in front of male interrogators. Sadly enough, our attempt to contribute for the betterment of our society lasted only for 2 years. But what we have done to deserve such end is a question. So I'm going to highlight some of the few things that we have done, which raises officials' eyebrows. In those 2 years, in addition to our regular blogging and posting articles, Zone 9 ran 4 successful online campaigns. The first campaign was entitled Respect the Constitution, was a call for political groups to respect the Constitution. This call may sound naive, but it really gathered attentions of different people online. And the difference about this Respect the Constitution campaign was that it really recognized the legitimacy of the Constitution and, of course, really appreciates the constitutional articles and rights given under the Constitution, but asks for different political groups to respect it. And that includes Ethiopian government, too. It was enough to attract attention from different corners. And then after 3 months, the second online campaign came to advocate for freedom of speech. And we are asking abolishing of different forms of censorship which are against the constitutionally recognized rights. And we keep on doing the campaign, so we came up with a third campaign idea, which focused on the freedom of association and assembly with a particular emphasis on demonstration, which attracted so many online participants to talk about the state of assembly rights in the country. By the time when we do this campaign, it has been 8 years since we had a last demonstration in the country, and it was quite silent, and no one was considering rights of assembly and demonstration as a part of right given under the Constitution. So we started provoking those rights and asking questions. These rights are given under the Constitution, but they are not being practical here. So we do have the rights, and even the motto was bring back our demonstration rights. The last online campaign was dedicated to dreams, just individuals' dreams for their country. We ironically call this campaign Ethiopian Dream, which happens to be disturbing for some of the authorities. As dream envisioned at the grassroots level turned not in line with the official propaganda. More than 150,000 people took part on social media reach. Articles, banners, posters published, and campaign messages are now being used as an evidence for the so-called terrorism trial we're facing. This trend of silencing dissent is not new and started long before the coming of those online bloggers. Iskandar Nagga, the veteran journalist and blogger, Riot Alamu, the courageous female reporter and columnist, Wubishat Taye, the former editor-in-chief of local newspaper, are among hundreds who are paying dearly for their attempt to voice in a different view from the single narrative that the government is framing. All face terrorism charges for writing. The ruling party in Ethiopia came to power in 1991, but the last 10 years that followed the controversial 2005 election, which was in detail explained by our friend Frewet, put the country in a downward spiral in terms of human rights and democracy. Since that fateful election, the government decidedly moved to close the political space and public sphere, which has never been fully free previously. Laws began to be introduced since then with the aim of limiting citizens' rights and freedom. The Access for Information and Mass Media Law of 2008, the Church and Societies Law and Anti-Terrorism Law of 2009 contributed for a complete closure of the space for different opinions other than the one which is being told by the government, which is revolutionary democracy and developmental state. Journalists and media personnel are expected to talk only for the development and the infrastructure progress going on. Currently, Ethiopian media scene remains with few private nuclear newspapers for 95 million people, a single state TV, and around 10 radio stations, from which one is only privately owned. It is not only that, the Ethiopian government is known for its online censorship of alternative sources of information. Hundreds of websites, including legally registered parties' websites operating in a country, are not accessible at home. The level of online censorship in Ethiopia does match with the level of the internet penetration in the country. And Ethiopia is also known for buying sophisticated surveillance softwares as one of the few countries in the world. Not more than 2% of the population access internet, as I said earlier, but the government is among the worst offenders of internet censorship. Until recently, internet was the only remaining and relatively free platform to share dissenting views without immediate reprisals. With the crackdown on online bloggers and online activists, the sphere is now becoming very dangerous. And thanks to the war on terror, Ethiopia is a de facto key partner in the region. As a tradition among the big Western donors has it, they care less when it comes to the human rights record of their partner. This coupled with the reported economic growth in the last 10 years. with no sign to attempt to improve the rights situation in general and the media in particular, the local efforts by journalists, bloggers, and activists lack support from the international community, donors, and also partners of the government. Ethiopian government receives an annual average of 3.5 up to 4 billion USD in aid from its donor partners that include the US, the UK, the EU, and the World Bank. We always ask if these donor countries and institutions care about the impact of their financial and political support to authoritarian regimes on the citizens of countries such as Ethiopia. Despite repeated calls for donors to pressure the Ethiopian government to improve its record of human rights, very little is achieved. The maximum the government partners can do so far is issuing reports and statements, while other bilateral donors act as if there is no relation between human rights and development at all. By disregarding the calls, donor governments are not only failing citizens who are trying hard at home and abroad to improve their countries, but they are also risking their own long-term strategic interest and money. Investing too much financially and politically where there is no political accountability, participation, and space for this can only be considered as a blank check for authoritarianism. Investing money in a country with no media, which will dare to talk about corruption, governance, and abuse of power, does not only harm the country and the people, but it would also make one raise a question on the intention of the donors. We should also bear in mind the obvious reason for this unconditional support is regional stability. But we should also again bear in mind that the regional stability that international community cares today might not stay for long if the silence keeps like this. I personally believe organizations supporting human rights and freedom should keep in mind that their support is useful, but can't substitute the role of those who struggle to secure their rights respected. Those who invest in the development-related areas also should ask if their investment is not used to repress others, instead of creating an enabling environment for locals to exercise their rights. Supporting human rights and freedom by developmental donors should not only be for the people, but also for their own sake. To the least, they should make sure that their money is being used for the given purpose effectively and efficiently. As a citizen from a donor-darling repressive country, what pains me most is not the financial support given for the authoritarian regime, rather the silence that those institutions say, the silence of those institutions and the silence being used by the government to confirm legitimacy for its repression. We all know donors appreciate sustainable development, and sustainability could not be ensured without public participation on governance and media. This participation includes criticizing government and electing your own leaders. Nathaniel Fellaka is a friend of mine now who is in prison and who has been the supporter of the developmental works of the ruling party, PRDF. And he also criticized the lack of space and freedom of expression in the country and who now end up in jail for it. Funding partners who claim to support the development keep ignoring the economist Nati and many more young professional people sacrificing their valuable time in prison for asking fundamental rights. While in other parts of the donors' world, it's not even an issue at all. So I'm going to show you one video to conclude my presentation.
Ethiopia is located in the Horn of Africa. The country is one of the greatest violators of freedom of expression. Ethiopia currently ranks 143 in the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. Critics usually say that even though countries like USA, UK, and Sweden gives a lot of money in development aid, there are no improvements in democracy and human rights. The country's constitution explicitly protects freedom of expression, but the government is not tolerant of diversity of opinions. When journalists and bloggers tries to tell the truth about violation against human rights, they are silenced. Ethiopia is not a democratic country, and journalists, opposition politicians, and human rights activists are getting jailed, often in the prisons of Kality and Kalento. The anti-terrorism law enacted 2009 has been used to prosecute journalists and bloggers under vague provisions. It contains unacceptably broad definitions for terrorist acts and has been widely criticized. There was a need for an alternative voice, and the Zone 9ers therefore began blogging and using social media to write on subjects related to human rights. The name of the group, Zone 9, refers to the zones of the notorious Kality prison. The prison has 8 zones, but the 9th zone refers to the rest of Ethiopia. Even being outside of the prison walls, you are never truly free. Any free-thinking individual who speaks out against injustice are risking to be arrested. They had campaigns about respecting the Constitution, stopping censorship, and respecting the right to demonstrate. They visited political prisoners and journalists and wanted to bring the public's attention to them. Zone 9 did a report and invited journalists to report and document about the repression they were facing. The group's work was constitutional, but the government labeled it a crime. The bloggers were under surveillance and harassment. April 25th, they were arrested. And the day after, 3 journalists were also arrested. The arrests were taken to the federal police station called Mekilawi. It's known for torture, poor detention conditions, and unlawful interrogation tactics.
What is their crime?
They demanded the Ethiopian government start to respect Constitution and end impunity in the country.
So, what are they accused of?
They're accused of working with foreign human rights organizations.
What?
And it's also even worse, they're also accused of terrorism.
How can working with human rights NGOs become an act of terrorism?
The Ethiopian government changed their original accusation from working with human rights organizations to serious terrorism charges when they get criticized for their first allegations. The government wants to jail the bloggers to silence them.
The bloggers and journalists are now in the prisons of Kality and Kolento. The situation in the prisons is horrible. Food is scarce, and there are hundreds of people in the zones. There are rats and fleas, and the guards beat and torture prisoners. Friends and family are forced to go through tremendously humiliating searches at the gates of the prison when they are allowed to visit, if allowed to visit at all. What the bloggers and journalists did is honorable. Ethiopia is in great need of change. There is still light. The jailings have sparked an outrage around the world, especially in social media. You can help too. Use the hashtag #FreeZone9Bloggers on social media. Help spread the information and let the world know. You can also read more about this at www.trialtrackerblog.org.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to use my time here to talk about giving aid in these very difficult places. I was introduced, and that's correctly, I'm a professor in the University of Oxford, and an academic, and I've worked for the last 25 years or so on a host of African countries, actually an awful lot of it in Ethiopia. But I think I should be honest and clear to actually declare also I'm the chief economist of DFID. I don't speak here as DFID, and that has a very simple reason, because I don't speak as DFID ever. I'm an advisor in the organization, I'm an academic brought in to help with thinking, with advice, and I work internally. But I'm talking here as an academic, and I hope you will respect that. Nevertheless, my last 3 years being able to work with DFID has given me the chance to travel a lot and spend a lot of time thinking about how do we try to overcome some of the conundrums, some of the fundamental problems of trying to give aid in the kind of places that are just very messy, very difficult. I think all the speakers have alluded to societies, states, where an awful lot of problems are there. Some have suggested it is largely, or to a large extent, responsibility of those aid organizations that they actually are given legitimacy, that they actually contribute as a result to what's going on there. Others have said there is a place to do this, there's a place for aid, but we have to think much more carefully. Some have talked about red lines, some have talked about other things. So I'm going to try my talk, try to reflect a little bit on some of these fundamental problems and try to actually suggest maybe some ways of thinking about it, of how we can try to do this. As I said, a lot of the countries where DFID is working in are these kind of messy places. And this is not just because they love places where there is a lot of mess per se, but these are the places with the highest extreme poverty in the world. In fact, if we look at any kind of projections of where poverty will be in the next 20, 30 years, it will be more and more in fragile places, quite messy environments, and so on. So you have a choice. You say, we ignore these places, or we try to be, as well as we can, as active as we can, to be there present in these kind of environments. I will come to the conclusion, I will put my point of view here, my personal point of view, that I think aid can actually do quite a lot of things, and I think it does quite a lot of good things in many of these settings, including in some of the very messy environments that people have alluded to. It is not, without question, it's not simple. It's not simply black and white and it's self-evident. Anyone who claims this, and I want to repeat this, is just sheer lying. These are very difficult problems and very difficult issues that need very, very careful thinking to try to get through it. Aid is something we've done for, well, at least 50 years. In fact, the current frameworks for thinking about aid come from the 1960s. In fact, the current rules almost, they started being formed in the context of the OECD. 1962, by 1966, they started talking about the need of rich countries to give 0.7% of their GDP, GNI to developing countries. We're going back a long time. It's an interesting, I come then in that sense from a different country, from an interesting country. I'm based in the UK. I'm not a UK national. UK government employs me, but I'm not a UK national. But it is quite a surprising situation that we're in there with that country, because we are in a country very different from where in the US, or in fact many other countries, where during economic crisis, we've actually increased the aid budgets substantially. The UK has become the first 0.7 donor amongst the G7 countries. We've increased aid. And it suggests we're in the middle of an election campaign, which is actually another reason why really no DFID officials can talk as DFID at the moment, because in a couple of weeks we have elections, so we have no government at the moment. We can't represent anything. And we can't really. But if you look at all the parties there, the two main parties are all fully committed to keep on doing this. To 0.7% of their GNI. Of all the other competitive parties that will win some seats here and there, 3 out of 4 are all totally committed to it. In fact, one of them is even asking for increasing in aid. There is one party that says we should abolish the aid budget, which is a UK nationalist party who also wants to get rid of all the immigrants and everything else in the country. I didn't say this properly. I did say this, but I didn't say this. I seem to have broken my rules as well. But anyway, I hope you will not abuse these things. That I like to talk quite frankly, and I will want to do this here as well. But it means also the UK has turned something. In a way, UK has turned Nordic. The only other countries in the world that do this are the Swedens, are the Norways, are the Finlands, are the Denmarks of the world. So we've turned Nordic, but we're still in Anglo-Saxon countries where fundamentally we actually do care a little bit what happens with the money. And so we're sitting in a very strange situation where it's not just from the moral good that aid is being given, but people also think it actually has a purpose. But at the same time, all political parties in the countries are fundamentally committed to anti-aid as well. They don't want to be tied to flying American Airlines or other American firms and so on. They don't believe in that kind of stuff, as some other countries may do. It's always openly tendered and so on. It's not simply a mechanism to promote your own business. Maybe indirectly, and we could think about it as well. But anyway, it's a quite interesting thing. It means also we are under a huge amount of scrutiny. The amount of scrutiny on all kinds of levels, including about corruption, about human rights and so on in terms of our money, it is actually, it surprised me coming in from outside government to work in government of how much scrutiny there is in terms of how people want to look at all the things we do. But then at the same time, politically, the choice is made that at least a third of our budget, which our budget is now something like, current exchange rate would be about $18 billion, more than a third has to be spent in the most fragile places in the world. A choice is made, it has to be done there. It's a commitment, an input target. So that's also quite something. So we are actually, as DFID, a surprising donor that wants to go for this 0.7 and buying into a kind of a development project. Now, the strange thing is that fundamentally, if you think, what does aid want to do? Well, actually, sometimes if you listen to the most obvious and the most simplistic communications for those who argue for aid, is to actually say, let's turn the world into Sweden. It's basically, the global aid narrative is one of basically saying, you know, we'll turn it into Sweden, a very stable, effective state that really cares for its poor, that values equality, that has an effective functioning and efficient state, that is quite statist narrative, and that has a welfare state, all these things, everything with all the trimmings. In fact, if you think about it, that seems to be what we stand for. And how do we do this? Via incremental process, which is a difficulty, but that's basically the narrative. We can bit by bit build Sweden. In fact, I would say this is one of these blueprints for Sweden we have. These are the Millennium Development Goals. You know, saying as long as we believe and as long as get hundreds of countries, 100 and so many, whatever it was, 179 countries, I think, signed the MDG, the Millennium Declaration. As long as we do that, as long as we all have these objectives, everything will be fine. And that's what we'll do. That's our objective. We'll turn the country, in all these countries, into this kind of this wonderful human development in the outcomes and all kinds of things. We're in the middle of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. It actually happens in New York. I know the US doesn't really pay that much attention to it, but it's quite a big thing in the aid business type of environment, where you kind of say you do this. And this kind of, these days, the SDGs, what will it be? I think it will just be something like this that will be very green looking. There are lots of sustainable words in front of every goal. 169 indicators we have to follow, more or less an incredible list of ingredients of what development will look like, which will include things about accountability and about jobs and all kinds of things, and very green things as well. Not entirely clear what the recipe is, but definitely 169 ingredients of what development will look like. So that's one phase of development. I don't think, if I now these days work in a development organization, that's not quite on the ground how one ends up trying to do the work. And what is happening, let me leave that, you get a very strange impression of who becomes the arbiter of development and so on. But actually, in reality, anyone working on the ground on development knows it's a very messy thing. It's a very difficult thing to do. And, you know, turning the world into Sweden is going to be quite a thing. It's not self-evident of how you create that beautiful society and where everything will turn very quickly in Sweden. In fact, that's what the world looks like, a very messy place. And, you know, maybe variations of messiness. You know, this is all different messiness, and it's not quite the same. None of that messiness is the same. Very locally, the environment you try to do this kind of idea that with incremental progress can be achieved by aid, you try to do this. But one thing people have increasingly recognized, and definitely I would say people who try to work on the ground on development, and I would definitely say that's something I observe, for example, in a DFID, is that development needs structures, needs institutions. We need effective, peaceful, and accountable states for development success. That's definitely very much an ingrained dogma in places which is very messy now. So people say, well, we need this, one way or another. We need this institutional thing. We need to find ways of creating this space for free media, for human rights, for the rule of law. But at the same time, within a reality, that is deeply messy. So, and the big challenge that we face when we're working from within development setting is to actually, you know what you want to achieve. You kind of know what you have as an ideal. You also know that getting that state effective and accountable is actually going to be quite important. But you really struggle to see how you actually contribute it. And you also struggle seeing, do you do harm, do you not do harm, and how you do this. And this world is very messy. So basically the conundrum is, how do you turn a mess into Sweden? Now, in general, and I see this in the UK, even political leadership sees this, that trying to get institutional development, state development, is going to be very important. In fact, under our current Prime Minister, he would talk about something like the golden thread. It was a list of nouns, but it had words like rule of law, free media, open access, open societies, property rights, all kinds of things that somehow wanted to identify with quite successful nations in the long run in development. And say, oh, we need to have, these are fundamental things. But it doesn't tell us very well of what the grammar is between this. How do you actually make this actually happening? How do you try to do this? Now, what kind of state is needed for development? I think so. One of the ways to think about it, and this is just my own thoughts now, is an effective state is something, lots of other, this is trying to be mixing lots of views on how the state comes, but I think can be around the ideas of authority, about capabilities and legitimacy. And basically, we want to actually have states that can and are willing to act in the interest of the citizens, one way or another. And it goes around, authority, like the Weberian concept of, monopolies of violence, the idea, but basically say there is safety within the borders for citizens. The state can actually guarantee and actually has some kind of authority, a capability that is actually, the willingness and the ability to actually act as a state to the extent that you need to act as a state, and on the legitimacy, fundamental ideas of accountability. Somehow that you're accountable for what you do, that you have legitimacy in how you work. And of course, we can have the extreme ones. It's very easy to identify lots of the extreme ones. The Afghanistans, the South Sudans at the moment. And we also know the beautiful ones, the Swedens of the world. To say, oh yeah, that's a good one. We tend to say everything in between, especially on the lower end, is pretty fragile. Lots of words that tend to be used. But it's then somehow that they have failings to do with authority, capability, and legitimacy. So now, I'm not saying that even in the literature, there are not differing views of whether that's really needed. For some people, if you go to Acemoglu Robinson, Why Nations Fail, it'd say, well, it's fundamental. If you don't have that institutional development, you won't get any ever development as a whole. You need to have these political institutions in place. They have to be inclusive, and if you have them inclusive, it will be good for development, and if they're non-inclusive, they will be bad for development. That's basically the whole book summed up, I think. That's about it. Two things, either in there or you're not in there, and and going from one to the other is a big jump. Okay, that's for me as involved in policy. It was very unhelpful in terms of saying, what the hell do we do now? But anyway, but Jim Robinson knows this very well. So and we're still trying to talk a lot on what could we do. Other people would say, fundamentally, from a rights-based approach, it is just development. It's not even something you need for development, it is development. And I have a lot of respect for that. And I think a lot of people here represent that as well. But you get other voices, Banerjee and Duflo, for example, would say, well, it's perfectly possible to have a lot of good things happening in policies and interventions when institutions are terrible, just as there are lots of bad policies possible when there are good institutions. I don't know whether they think locally about the country they live in, but you can do lots of bad things even if your institutional development is there, and vice versa. And they say, well, actually, that relationship is not really fundamentally there. I'm actually tempted to say, well, I tend to be my own thinking closer to Jim and Daron Acemoglu, Jim Robinson and Daron Acemoglu, at times say there is something there that's fundamental. But again, it's very hard. So where does 8 fit into it? Well, 8 tends to say, well, we want to use 8 also to contribute that. If we go 50 years back, World Bank would say 8 will be effective if there's good policies or good institutions, and otherwise 8 is not effective. Well, I would kind of say, well, surely 8 is endogenous there as well. And if we do something sensible, we'll have to actually use it also to try to help to create that peaceful and effective accountable state. And it has to be used to that. And I think that's these days much more the view. Definitely in the organization I work in, that seems to be the view. We need to be part of it. Or put it differently, actually being involved in aid is also about working politically. You can't just say as if you can just ignore this and have been totally separate, as if you can be totally out of politics, because being out of politics is political as well. And so you're there as well. So, but the idea is we need to do that, because otherwise we can't really deliver the aid either. We need that kind of progress, otherwise we can't really deliver the aid, otherwise there's risk of misappropriation, corruption, conflict, and so on. Legitimacy gets promoted and so on. And we need that effectiveness, otherwise we can't really get to poverty reduction and more development. But it's quite important when we say aid has a role to play in this, is that we believe that incremental change is possible. Okay? And that's actually quite important to see this. But we also have to realize, and I think people more or less realize this, that to start with, aid undermines this as well. In a very fundamental, okay, it's an abstract way, but it's very easily understood, is that actually by giving aid, you don't make those who receive it, you do lots of things. You give incentives for undermining, first of all, the authority, because actually you get something that other people could fight for. You actually potentially make something, well, let me try to fight to control the aid. And that's actually something there. So you could even undermining the authority. You could also be undermining fundamentally the accountability and the effectiveness, because at the same time, you have very few incentives to make the whole system sustainable, to make the system responsible for itself. For example, what are the incentives if you give a lot of aid to actually generate your own revenue from developing a good relationship with your citizens, with your business, and actually finding a way of actually reinforcing that cycle? Because if I can't get taxes from this business, they will demand services, and I get some accountability relationship. So it's actually, you should know this. When you start with aid, the initial incentives are negative. So therefore, how you use it is crucial. You need to actually overcome that negative incentives to actually do something positive for helping to build the state. So it's a pretty difficult one. You know, it can lead to some people saying, surely it's fundamentally flawed and you'll just never succeed. I say, well, sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't do it well. Putting this in practice, and I want to use the last bits of my time to say the kind of states we then meet in practice. What are the kind of states we meet to actually try to do aid on? And what does it mean? Well, we need quite a lot of different types of states. And I will talk very quickly about 4 different types. The way often we talk about Africa is if Africa is simple. No, of course it's not simple. And I have at least 4 categories. I probably could have 39 categories. I could probably say, well, each of them have slightly different features. And in fact, all of them could have elements of all. The obvious ones, the extreme ones, we often talk about failing states. We can also have very predatory states. I'll talk about it. And then I'll talk 2 cases that we have more of and that actually that actually give us the real challenge. The illiberal state, builder states. Okay? And it's in the latter case that I will talk about some of the countries that were mentioned quite a lot today. So the failing states, let me do quickly. Well, all these things tend to fail. Authority, capability, legitimacy. You know, these are the countries of, then they're ugly places. Hyenas is something there. There's something there that's not great. How you can do aid there? Well, you can't use the state really, because the state lacks all the things that you would need. Even if you wanted to go via the state, you couldn't have it anyway. They lack authority, typically conflict-affected states, legitimacy, fundamental legitimacies, and so on. So can we promote development anyway? It all very quickly comes into humanitarian function. You end up probably doing bits and pieces largely from a humanitarian thing. And I'm not saying that's not without any problems, because again, by being there as humanitarian, you are political as well, you make choices and you get into all kinds of messes as well. But maybe you can focus on things that at least you can reach directly people with things they can't take away. Well, for example, I would say, whatever we think these days about Afghanistan, there's a lot of girls' education you can never take away from these women again. You can never take it away from them. It doesn't mean you did anything else good. Maybe you did worse things as well, and I would come to it. Because maybe you make it actually worse in the long run, and that's as well. And you have to really be very, very careful how you do this. I don't think there is an obvious answer there. It's very case to case. But how you do in these really failing places, there's a humanitarian call to try to be there. You don't sometimes do it well, sometimes do it badly. Even in the same place, you do good things, you do bad things. And there's a lot to be learned still on how we do this in the humanitarian space. But for me, the counterfactual is there as well. There's a huge amount of misery in these kind of places at a large scale. And it's probably very hard to actually say, well, just staying away and ignoring it is just as well. I don't think anyone is arguing that in 84, 85, in the end, it was not a good idea to give aid during the famine in Ethiopia, however it may have been used and how it may have played in political games and so on. But maybe there are some. And I'm willing to hear that always. There's predatory states that are the extremes, which are states that fundamentally, sometimes they have actually a lot of authority, sometimes they don't. But where you get really the kind of further perversity as well, where all the incentives are, you know, to actually where the capabilities tend to be used to exploit people. Where actually you get so, think of it the latter stages of Mobutu's Congo, where the whole system is basically everybody fetches for themselves. So it means if you have a civil servant, you basically try to screw the people. And you try to get anything you can from the people and line the pockets, and you get a plundering state in the extreme form. Perverse legitimacy, I mean, it's absolutely the opposite. There's no attempt to do legitimacy. It's actually just the reverse. It feels, you know, never do it. Predatory tigerfish, one of these fish in the Congo River that just loves eating little fish. And I can't see any other purpose for that animal. And it's quite an ugly one as well. Aid relationships there as well. Really tricky things. You end up substituting for state failure. You may want to do parallel systems because there's a lot of misery there as well and very hard. Maybe you could get aid to flow in certain things, and you can do this. I think the best thing you can do there is to really be on top of the politics and the political economy, what's going on, and see whether you have pockets, places you can do certain things. And actually, interestingly, you can see cases where some good things are done. Of course, a lot of things that in the end maybe have proved very bad as well and doing. So case by case is possible. But I would say the extreme predatory and failing states are probably quite rare in Africa, because actually the more common one is this one, the neo-patrimonial state. This is referring to Max Weber, who talk about fundamentally states that are based on patron-client rules. It's basically where there is a formal state developing, but on the side of it, there's a formal state that looks like the state, but actually it's all about patron-client relationships, informal networks, and so on. Other people have called this a redistributive state, where one group gets all the public resources and brings it to a particular group of people, a selected group of people, followers to loyalty. So you get these things that tend to be very personalized. You often have very personalized leadership. And you get basically transfers, for example, based on ethnic alliances, small groups of cronies, and things like that. But, you know, it has the trimmings. It looks like a modern state to some extent. It has all the ministries and all the things are there. But actually, there's an awful lot there going on that you need to understand properly. I think actually a lot of states have this to some extent or not in an African context. You know, if I were going to go for examples, Uganda has a lot of features of that. You have Tanzania's there, you have Kenya there, with features of these kind of places in various degree, with more accountability, less accountability. I would say Ghana is there probably as well. It's this kind of state that sometimes people describe that we see in Africa, which is a ship not seeking to go anywhere, but simply staying afloat. You know, something that is all based on temporary alliances, maybe manipulation of electoral systems, very good playing around with the things. The kind of, it's our time to eat kind of logic. It is now we are power, now it's we will eat for 4 years, and then this kind of way of doing the politics. And of course, even our own democratic systems at times have features of that as well. We should not say that we're immune to these kind of things as well. For me, there's a bit like hippos, you know, they're floating. They seem to be far too big, these states, for what they're actually doing. It's very unclear what their purpose is. They seem to be floating aimlessly. They can be very dangerous as well. I understand more people get killed from hippos than any other animal in Africa. These are particular places. I think these are the ones, they are unclear. But there's a very interesting thing, because I find These are the states, when I travel to a lot of these places and spend time in African countries, this is the ones you meet and you hear about, where there is actually very little interest, it feels, from the political leadership to actually use development and growth and human development as something to get legitimacy from. It seems to be about something else. It is something about maybe a reproduction of dysfunctionality. It's not particularly looking for anything more. There's predatory behaviors in pockets. There's other things there as well. So how do you do in aid in that? Well, you know, there's authority often, not very good capability. There's little pockets maybe. There's some legitimacy. There's electoral process, sometimes free media, but it's not always clear. So it's a very ambivalent relationship. I think that's the one we got used to and we're trying to do as good as we can. And I'm not saying we do very well, but it's an imperfect state worth trying to make more effective and accountable, and something, a place where we think there's a job to be done. But fundamentally, we should recognize, and this is something internally we did an exercise in a lot of the countries we work in across the world, we actually simply asked the question, is fundamentally the elite here aligned with getting growth and poverty reduction in the country? And actually, of all the countries we have a really intensive program, only 2 out of 28 came out with, say, fundamentally we can say the elite seems to be aligned with this purpose. A lot of these places, to some extent, to a less extent, this is not based on, say, politics that has this thing. And I know I need to hurry up a bit. So we have some successes, some failures. And I will come to the last case, and then I will want to be, well, and I know I will be more controversial. And that's this final group, which I find personally a really interesting case, but a very hard one to deal with. And a lot of people are kind of underestimating what's going on there and why this creates such tensions as we also have in the discussion. It's a class of countries where we have a leadership with genuine ambitions in state building and development. So you get these states, you know, the Rwanda's, Ethiopia of the world. There's a couple more in various ways. Sudan has sometimes trimmings on it, Angola has sometimes trimmings on it, but Rwanda, Ethiopia are definitely the cases that are very interesting here. Where you actually have the roaring lions, you know, kind of quite strong states, often emerged from victory in conflict, stable with a monopoly of violence, you know, the Weberian definition, they have that, you know, there's a control there, and we hear that today as well about. They have a modernist developmentalist ideology. And that goes beyond, and maybe some people here would disagree, but I think it goes beyond simply the kind of neo-patrimonial redistribution to one group of people. We could argue about it and think about it and think it, but I think it goes beyond that. Because fundamentally what they're not neo-patrimonial is that they actually seek legitimacy through development, even though they don't want to have, they have no question of their authority. There's other ways for them to keep control, but they seek legitimacy through development. This is, I think, what we've been observing in Rwanda and Ethiopia. And occasionally we've been having them. It is more maybe East Asian, yes, but it is still quite different, nested within an African context. They even have moves to deal with the roots of the conflict. And, you know, if you think in Rwanda, where you try to even work at, and you can agree or disagree, but what this tends to be called a social constructivist view on ethnicity. Put it very simply, is that ethnicity never existed. It was invented in colonial times. It was a social construct, and it never existed. There is no such a thing as a Hutu and a Tutsi. There's some genuine, reasonable scholarship around that, other people that would not necessarily agree it, but you say that becomes the way of trying to deal with a fundamental conflict in society. You have ways of dealing with conflict theories as well. Ethiopia with the idea of federalism, and we can talk about it as well there as well, with very strong structures, some more military, some more party-based. I would say Ethiopia more party-based, Rwanda definitely more military-based, with strong leadership. Quite effective, and this is where it all comes. They're quite effective. Their legitimacy, their source of legitimacy can come partly from promoting development. So that actually creates somehow, or they're seeking, the legitimate seeking behavior comes from delivering development. So you get there, a huge dilemma for aid, okay? And so it's, and I'm coming close to my final 2 slides here. This is not legitimacy through accountability. This is seeking legitimacy through development and state building. And there's a huge dilemma for anyone involved in the business. And I'll try to explain that dilemma, which is, When you deal with a neo-patrimonial state, you are dealing with a state that is weak on all these features of authority, of accountability, of legitimacy, of effectiveness, and so on. So you have this kind of vision, oh, well, anything to do with development is complementary to it, because we need to build up that state a bit, make it more effective and everything. And so we have this kind of nice alliance. There's no conflict between what you may be doing there. The problem is that here, you actually are meeting quite an effective state. Okay, and so we can argue about it. But having worked a lot on some of the data, you know I've questioned some of them, but in general, the kind of progress that's been made in Rwanda and Ethiopia is a form of convergence to where the region was. The improvements in human development indicators in Ethiopia is quite spectacular. And the effectiveness of aid, because they don't actually per capita, don't get as much aid, for example, compared to Uganda or Kenya. But actually the convergence of it is actually quite remarkable. I've questioned the agriculture data at some point, but there is still massive growth in agriculture. There's massive growth in GDP, maybe not as big as it is, and we could argue about it. The same in Rwanda. The progress is there, and we're struggling with that. So from an aid point of view, if you say, well, but we thought we need to build up the state because it's good for human development, for economic development, they seem to have an alternative way of doing this, and it creates a huge dilemma. And where do you have to then deal with? Okay, so it's this breakdown of these combined weaknesses of all the things that actually create some of the problems. How do you deal with this? And that's really the tricky thing. And that's my last substantive point here. So you have a lot of progress, but we can't deny that from our own standards, these human rights are tricky. And you can't simply do as some people do, oh, but it's a Benthamite calculus, a couple of people in jail relative to a lot of improvements in vaccines. This kind of number game, you can't play this. You have to be much more honest. It's not simply of throwing some numbers around it. It's language of a price to pay. I would never buy this. Okay? I would not want to go for that. Also, just the emotional approach doesn't help either. And I think I sometimes worry in debates around as well. I will say red lines are actually quite unhelpful. And I will try to explain this. Political conditionality is really difficult because there's very little credibility in it. Ex-ante defining the lines that are absolute are really hard. It doesn't mean you don't think politically, but simply saying this is the thing or this is defining the threshold. I've seen enough from the way policymaking is done that actually policymaking is always about interpreting that at that particular moment how you act. This kind of simple rule-based is very hard. But it doesn't mean you can't have principles. Okay? So I don't want to say, oh, well, anything goes. And the three principles I want to say is that engaging as a donor with countries like that, the illiberal state builders, the ones where they are doing quite well in building the state and indeed in delivering development, but in a very illiberal way in the original meaning of the word. If this human development and growth is not taking place, well, then there is no source really of actually that kind of engagement. So that's an important part of it. But also you have to ask yourself, and that's why the red lines is very hard, you have to think at each moment in time with your actions, what is the counterfactual? What if we do this? What is the alternative? And it's a very hard one. That's forward-looking, that's not simply backward-looking, that's not absolutist, but it's actually interpreting what you have. What will happen to development gains, to conflict, stability, accountability? You can't do that as a lazy exercise. I know too often that's done as a lazy exercise. You have to think very deeply about that. And then the final thing, which I value very important, which is very hard. Acemoglu and Robinson have a very nice paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in terms of saying how you should think about political equilibria. And you say, well, you have to judge this dynamically. You have to judge whether what you're doing, is it making it less likely for the emergence of a longer-term equilibrium or not? So what is your long-term theory of change has to be there. You have to keep that in mind. And it's not about one being more important than the other. It has to be there. So anyway, I bet I've given you food for thought and disagreement as well. What we do in development aid is politics. Building this effective accountable state is an important part of the development project. The more committed donors, I think, they want to actually try to think carefully through this. And I don't think it's an easy job. In some states, the dilemmas are not that big because the progress you can make on all the elements of authority, of legitimacy, accountability, are actually complementary to what you tend to do. But in the case of the illiberal state builders, you are faced with a really difficult choice. And simple political conditionality, and it's actually about the naive simple conditionality, as we did, for example, in the 1990s in Kenya, that backfired entirely, is very hard. But looking for some principles that need to look at the counterfactual, the theory of change of it all, and indeed a proper judgment about what's going on the development side is important. Easy answers? No way. Thank you.
I think we all acknowledge that we've raised some very complicated questions here and that there are no easy answers. One of the things you said, Stefan, was that governments have to care and be willing to act in the interests of their citizens. And, you know, in our country and in yours, the state actually is forced to care to some extent about its citizens. The last time I looked, the STGs didn't say anything about free and fair elections, free expression, and impartial justice. And I'm not sure whether that's still true. I haven't looked recently, but that would be my question. And maybe, but we'll take others. So please. Yeah, thanks.
My name's Karen Colvard. I work for the Harry Guggenheim Foundation, and I'm familiar with a number of smaller private foundations that fund in Africa. Our discourse is always about going around the state, and one of the papers I've heard this morning are all about either bilateral or multilateral donations to states, or as the Zone 9 people show, there's a lot of activity going on within states, within all of those categories that you very usefully pointed out. And that private foundations generally think that the best thing to do is to fund civil society, to fund those NGOs, to fund those groups like Zone 9, and let them further question the legitimacy and effectiveness of their state, whatever model it might be. That's not a question, but why aren't we talking about both things? Funding for states and funding for the opponents and critics of states.
Good afternoon. My question is, you're talking about using institutions to be funded in Africa to allow development. Why is it that the World Bank does not look at civil society as an entity that can be funded to allow development? Also, where does one go when the World Bank is the violator of human rights, as the case was in Uganda in 2010? The World Bank, in alliance with the government, evicted 20,000 local Ugandans in interest of creating a forestry industry. Where does one go? Last question. How do you deal in the process of thinking politically, where people say it's politically smart because Yoweri Museveni is not Idi Amin, Joseph Kabila is not Mobutu, and Heliman is not Meles Zenawi? How do you handle that?
Maybe one quick answer for the first recommendation, funding civil society so that it can balance all the questions that we're raising here. But in Ethiopia, I think that's not going to be a possible case, because one of the challenges after 2009 is, like, we do have a 2009 civil society proclamation which prohibits funding for advocacy, human rights works, and governance. Therefore, if you're a civil society and if you are working on governance, advocacy, and human rights, you can't get funding from any foreign sources. That's how the law says. Therefore, one of the challenges, in addition to the one that I mentioned regarding the media climate and everything, is that this law completely crippled every civil society activity in country, and you can give funding if you are only working on development. That's how it works.
On the SDGs, the question there, I think you have to understand that this is a UN process, and it's a UN-led process. That means that it's General Assembly that will vote, and you just have to ask yourself who has the majority there. It's definitely been a UK position, which I don't need to defend or not, so actually it would have been very important that the SDGs had a very much clearer sense of commitments towards building open societies and building open economies in it. But G77 thought differently about it. I mean, a huge amount of the aid budget, for example, of the UK, doesn't go through the state. It's a very large part will go through civil societies, directly with all kinds of things in countries, promoting civil society organizations, think tanks, thinkers, and so on, so on. And these are important mechanisms to try to help to contribute to building, effective and accountable states. I looked at the numbers. In terms of the financial aid, things that go through government system of the entire DFID budget, it is less than a third that goes to government systems, that is spent through government systems. Right.
So, I mean, is it really aid when it happens in that kind of non-democratic context? Yeah.
Great.
Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Graham. In your lectures, you gave that the development and the aid is more political. But one thing I haven't heard, right, through all the years that I've been involved with organizing, I have never heard not one of the governments ever putting the donor, everybody talk about raising the money, but never putting the donor where it goes towards the citizens of the individual country and helping to get procurements. Now, we have over $1 billion procurement that goes into Africa. My question to you is that can we get a program through the G8 that gives so much money into actually targeting the procurement, because there's over $1 billion procurement in the continent. That's basically thanks.
I just wanted to say thank you for your work, Soleyana. It's good to see you again, and for the courageous work of you and your colleagues. Two questions. One is, why is nobody addressing the elephant in the room? The reason that so much money flows to Ethiopia, that flows to Uganda, that flows to Kenya, is that when it goes across the desks of the leaders of the UK and the leaders of the United States, Obama and David Cameron, they see East Africa, they see one thing, al-Shabaab in Somalia. We need to support those countries so that they support our efforts there. Bribery writ large to achieve our political aims in the region. If you look at a map of the world, Transparency International's map of the world, you see severe corruption occurring in 7 out of 10 countries. I cannot compare what I saw in Uganda, where the president took all the money in the treasury and then spent it on his election campaign, an equivalent amount to what Obama spent on his election campaign, something in the realms of $350 million. We do, perhaps we had levels of corruption in the past like that. But what we did in America is we prosecuted people. We didn't go to Al Capone and say, perhaps we should have workshops, perhaps we could give you examples of livelihood alternatives to your running of organized crime networks. We prosecuted him. I would suggest that when individuals engage in grand corruption on the level described, that there should be an international mechanism, one proposed by Judge Mark Wolf and other people like John Gitongo, amongst others, is the creation of an international anti-corruption court. And I would personally get strongly behind that, and I think it could be something that we could do effectively.
Do you want to respond to anything? If you want
Well, just two quick points. On this idea of one way of assisting on the winning procurement, I think it's a very decent, sensible proposal. I mean, it is something like saying, trying to get up systems locally to work so that these procurements can actually happening, which is, pretty sensitive for the OECD country governments as well. And so, but that seems to be a more reasonable way of doing it, rather than actually saying, let's actually only focus on Mr. Museveni and having a kind of a court system that is totally faced only towards Africa, but actually that doesn't help to clean up the thing.
Could be Ukraine, could be anyone in Latin America.
No, sure. Look, it's a good idea, and I would actually say write it up and if people propose it. And it's good. And there are people trying to work on it. And people are seriously trying to get ideas of what we can actually get in place. And the whole thing about the bigger question there on the geopolitics of it all, let's put it simply, it's always been above my paycheck. So